going to roll right into this. CDM's been working on these issues for a long time. When we first started, we realized there was a need. There was a lot of information out there, but it was hard to get at. And so we developed what's called the Storm Smart Codes program. The concept was to create a clearinghouse of all this information. This began a lot of years ago. Over that time, we've developed our own things in there, but we've collected a lot of information and put under there. We've broken it up into some different areas for different user groups. First one, Storm Smart Communities. This is for local officials. It gives them some tools, some resources to address things that they're working on. Also, another area is Storm Smart Property. This is a tool for property owners, homeowners. We've got fact sheets and a lot of resources under that area. There's assessing vulnerability in coastal properties, and new area, CZM grant programs that I'll talk about. The first one is called the Coastal Communities Resilient Grant Program. The second one is the Green Infrastructure Grant Program. And the idea here is to steer communities towards using natural approaches to address storm damage, coastal erosion, and flooding problems. The first one, the Coastal Resilient Grant Program, projects have to implement one or more of these four Storm Smart Climate adaptation actions. And the first one is a public education piece. The second one covers assessing vulnerability and risk. Third one is identifying and implementing management measures or policies locally. And the last one is redesigning different infrastructure to adapt to changing conditions. The Green Infrastructure Grant Program, this is a little bit different. Like I mentioned, it's aimed at steering communities towards a natural approach to this type of mitigation. It's got to be one of these 5 categories. The first one is beach, berm, and dune building. That's a common technique around the Cape Islands. You see a lot of it. Second area is bioengineering projects. These typically use natural materials such as wire logs, wire envelopes, and combine it with mitigation planting. Another type of project is natural oyster or mussel reef projects. We're seeing some of those around. Also, fringing salt marsh creation or restoration. And finally, natural enhancement of existing coastal hard structures, where you're trying to modify and soften impacts. So these grant programs, who's eligible? Well, as you can see, it's 78 coastal communities. This is what is the coastal zone in Massachusetts, these pink areas. So it's a municipal grant program, but CZM is really encouraging communities to partner with other groups. We're funding a lot of projects that are partnerships. So if you're an NGO, a homeowners association, any type of these organizations can partner with your municipality and apply for grant funds. Under the Green Infrastructure Grant Program, awards can be up to $750,000 annually. Under the Coastal Resilience Grant Program, the awards can be up to $300,000 annually. It's a 12-month grant program, and this creates a lot of challenges for projects because it's by the time they're selected and contracted, communities typically have somewhere around 8 months to get the project done. So you can't bite off too much. It can be done in a compressed period of time. It makes for challenging sort of project management to make sure that they're accomplished. The annual grant awards are up to $3 million combined for both programs. In the 3 rounds of funding that we've had, we've funded 54 projects statewide, and we've awarded a total of $7.4 million so far. So right now, I want to jump right into some of the projects. This is one in Nantucket. It's underway. It's an inundation and pathways study. The focus of the project is really to do a flood study of Nantucket, a lot of the low-lying downtown areas. And what they've done is use very accurate topography and then use some modeling to determine how the flooding occurs. Anyway, you can see here's Brant Point area. The flooding, what they've determined, it comes in. A lot of people think of it as coming just across the beach and up over. It doesn't really do that. It comes through specific low areas, and these are what they call flood pathways. Understanding that and how these work at different flood stages helps flood managers and town officials dealing with that come up with better flood management strategies, either stopping it or controlling it, diverting it to more resilient parts of these areas. So it's a fairly innovative approach. We're funding another project in Provincetown. This one This is a retrofitting type project. This one's in Oak Bluffs, retrofitting some pump stations, modifying 3 pump stations. These are sewer pump stations that are in a flood zone. And you can see the project area there right behind the Oak Bluffs Harbor. There's a picture of one of the small pump stations getting flooded. This is flood zone, and these 3 primary wastewater pump stations serve 90% of the wastewater system. So if a hurricane were to come up late summer, the island's at capacity, this went down and be a major problem for the town. So with this project, we want to retrofit them to existing flood levels, but then also take into account sea level rise. And we used a 40-year design life of the equipment that these pump stations had. And then we used a 100-year projection of sea level rise, which was kind of in the middle of the curves. And 40% of that equaled 1.5 of additional elevation to accommodate sea level rise over the life of the project. The modifications themselves are very standard. They were elevating electrical service and control panels, elevations, putting elevated platforms for emergency backup generators, and then installing protective floodgates around the structures themselves. So pretty standard project, but incorporating sea level rise was a real good part of it. This was one community rating system. You've obviously just heard about that. A few years ago, we funded a project with Barnstable to hire resources, to hire some help to develop an application for the town of Barnstable. They did that. They also developed an activity guide template for other communities. The goal was to help them get through it, but they also came up with some recommendations for future floodplain management activities. And this was one of the projects that I think the Barnstable County thinking about continuing this effort, obviously hiring you in the thing. So it was nice to see the continuation of this kind of work. This is a project we have ongoing right now in Brewster called our Coastal Adaptation Strategy. This is a public outreach project, and the town, their goal is to seek a lot of public information and to gather community input, educate them on the vulnerabilities in town, how they think sea level rise and climate change can affect the resources of Brewster. And then from that, build some consensus on local strategies and some management principles for the town going forward. This project was based on some previous work that the town of Brewster has done. They've been very progressive in the work that they've done on trying to address climate adaptation. But some of that work has caused a lot of conflict locally in town. And through that process, the town has realized they hadn't done as good a job in engaging the public. And you've heard that theme over and over again tonight. But this was real world experience. And I'll talk about the other project that sort of triggered this. We're going to switch gears, talk about the green infrastructure grant projects. This one just finished up. It's in Barnstable Harbor. You're probably all familiar with this. The project was to stabilize Blish Point and Billway Beach using sandfill choir bags and plantings. And the interesting part of it, it's protecting an engineered containment basin that if you look at it, you think it's a normal coastal dune. It's right up here in this area. That's where the project is. That containment basin is used periodically when they dredge Barnstable Harbor. There's a lot of non-beach compatible material. So they've placed it in that for years. It dries out over the years. And then maybe 7 or 8 years later when the harbor gets dredged again, they dig out that material. That gets put in upland disposal because it's not beach compatible. And then they have a new place to put the new non-beach compatible material. So it's an important piece of infrastructure for the town of Barnstable. You can see this is the area last winter experiencing heavy erosion from our winter storms. Some of the area right there, some of the dredge material is starting to become exposed. So the project was using these choir-filled bags or choir-filled envelopes. How they work, they build plywood forms right here. They use this choir material, they lay it in the forms, they fill these with sand. Once they're filled with sand, as you can see right there, they fold them back over and they sew them up like a big sand sausage. So this is, you can see them being installed right here. This is looking to the east, that's looking to the west. This is looking to the west. They've done usually multiple rows. Here you can see multiple rows. They do one at the base and build them up. When they're finished, they get covered with sand and usually planted with native plantings. This is the project being finished when it was done in May. Covered with sand, planted, and then they put sand fencing around it, mostly to keep people off, but also to trap some sediment. Another one, go back to Brewster. This one is parking lot relocation at Breakwater Beach. This is, actually I have to give Sea Grant credit for this. Greg Berman, he used his drone to shoot this a couple weeks ago before the start of the project. The idea was this parking lot was sustaining heavy damage during winter storm events. You can see the sand material that's been placed in front of that to try to maintain it. But the town has been gradually losing the parking spaces there. Hard access down to the flats right there. And so the town came up with the concept to remove the seaward end of the parking area, restore that to dune, and then the parking lots, the parking spaces that they lost on the seaward end, to build those up here in this site way at the top to replace those and get them out of harm's way, out of the flood zone. Also, as part of this project, they want to install stormwater treatment, which this didn't have before, and provide a seasonal boardwalk. This shows you just a plan on the heart of the project. The revised parking lot. This is coastal dune that they're doing, and the bioretention for the stormwater, and this relocated parking spaces up here with porous pavement. Town thought it was a good idea. We thought it was a good idea. We funded it. When the project went to permitting, the neighbors there, they were very concerned about the project. It was mostly stemmed around the moving parking lot back towards some of the neighborhood areas. And they appealed the process, and the permitting process stalled it. And they created a big discussion in town. It's a very local homeowners group, and they petitioned the town to have a town meeting to vote on this and general coastal management issues that were going on in the town. They had a special town meeting. Fortunately, by a close vote, the residents of Brewster voted to move forward with this and with a bunch of other coastal projects. It was this project that sparked the need to have Brewster go and apply for that community outreach project, to step back, try to involve everyone and get some guiding principles going forward to deal with this. Another one, I'm sure you've heard about this, Town Neck and Sandwich. This is a project we've been working on over a number of years. This is underway right now. It's to identify a sediment borrow source for material to place onto Town Neck to restore that barrier beach system, and to go through the scientific assessment that you need and apply for permits to hopefully get a source for that project. Town Neck, you can see since 2013 had a nice well-vegetated coastal dune system out here. In a couple short years, this was last winter, you can see that the dune system has been totally wiped out. There's a lot of overwash in the creek. Again, I have to credit Greg Berman and his drone for that photograph. But you can see the need for the project right there. This project piggybacks on a previous CCM resiliency grant, which was the first phase of this project, where we funded the town to design and permit the beach nourishment portion of this. So they came up with a nourishment template for the barrier beach. The final design is about 400,000 cubic yards. Part of that is going to be accomplished by the canal dredging project, which I'm sure you've all heard about, they're in the papers. That's about 150,000 cubic yards. It still leaves the town about 250,000 yard deficit. So that's the project that we're doing right now to help them identify a source of that needed, the balance of the material. So I think they're looking at is just west of the entrance jetty at the canal in front of the Scusset State Park. And specifically, this is the area that they're focused on concentrating on right now. Like a lot of these projects, it's challenging because there's a lot of different interests here. There's fisheries interest right there. There's good lobster habitat just offshore. There's nesting bird habitat. There's recreation interest right there. It's a state park. So it's going to be a complex project, but we're optimistic that we can help them work through this, help them restore Town Neck Beach. this is one, I mentioned partnerships. This is a project that we funded out on the vineyard, Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group, and a couple of towns out there, Oak Bluff, Stuber, and Edgertown. The idea was to do some pilot salt marsh restoration work, and the concept is to use these wire logs and develop at the same time some fishery, some laboratory techniques, hatchery techniques, I should say, to raise good mussels, which are used along with salt marsh grass, and create a stable biomass so that eroding salt marsh area behind that can then stabilize and recover. The areas, they did it in 2 different sites. They wanted to look at some lower energy sites and some high energy sites. They did it up in Lagoon Pond and then Century Tackett Pond, Traps Pond. This shows the project, what they do. These are these wire logs. They stake them in front of this eroded salt marsh area. They use bags of mulch to anchor them and also to gather natural set. But then they take these logs and they take the small mussel seed. They actually plant them inside this, alongside salt marsh Spartina plugs. As they grow, the idea is that they'll create a very stable biomass. The excrement from the mussels fertilizes the salt marsh, and it creates a very strong system. This shows some of the installations. Overall, they learned an awful lot. They were successful with the hatchery techniques, raising the ribs mussels. They learned a lot about setting the elevation of these. There was some settling, so they learned how to try to avoid that. And they had some success with them on a very small scale project. The low area sites, not surprisingly, did better. They did it, they performed well enough that they're doing a couple of larger scale projects this coming season out there. So those are just a smorgasbord of different types of projects that were funded.
Yeah. Thank you. Just happy to moderate questions. I'll go with you first.
I live in Falmouth. Why is that got a funny color? They're not doing anything, right?
On my maps?
Yeah.
Yes.
Why has that occurred?
Because the town staff have decided at this point not to, or they haven't decided what to do about the CRS yet, if they want to join or not. Falmouth did actually participate in the CRS when it was first started in the early 90s. I'm not sure why they stopped participating, but we're just working to try to figure out what to do next. So I can't really tell you. I don't know why they have not made a decision yet or what their decision will be. But I would encourage you to reach out to the town and ask that.
That costs us, people like myself, more money.
Yeah.
What's the matter with it?
I think it's important also to paint a picture so no town looks like really bad compared to another town that a few months ago, only 2 or 3 communities on the Cape participated in the CRS, and very few out of the 78 coastal communities in Massachusetts were even participating in the CRS. So it is a new wave, as Shannon mentioned in her presentation. It's very labor intensive and resource intensive for the towns to participate, and that was one of the barriers that they all identified, which was why there was such low participation statewide. So with Shannon's coming on stream, she's just been here 3 months. She's been trying to work with communities to do that, and some other efforts have gone on in other communities like Barnstable and other places before Shannon came that kind of set the tone for those communities to kind of be ready to jump right in, like the grant Steve talked about with Barnstable, some of the work we did with Barnstable. And so Falmouth is not that they're not doing anything. I mean, this will be another conversation that will be happening. I mentioned the project that we did with them, kind of bringing all their local officials together to talk about that. So they are working on resiliency issues. Regarding the CRS, that would be another specific, I'm sure you're going to be following up with them, but I just didn't want Falmouth to look like they were the only ones. Other towns are just jumping on board because Shannon has come on stream, so I assume that might change. David?
I had a question as a person that lives outside the 100-year flood zone. One of the things that concerns me is that 40% of our residents are on the state fair system. And having lived in Louisiana before I moved to Cape Cod, I know that people get water damage from hurricanes. Well, not only from the rain, but actually the storm surge extends well outside the flood zone. a lot of people are at risk. And the concern I have is that if we have a serious hurricane, like Hurricane Bob, which is a minor event, whether the state's gonna be able to insure, if the private insurance companies remove themselves from Cape Cod, whether the state's gonna have the resources to cover everybody or a significant larger proportion of our residents outside the 100-year flood zone in the fare system.
Sure. So the fare system is gonna, in terms of damage from hurricanes, is gonna cover you more under wind. Private companies typically do not cover flood insurance. Homeowners insurance does not include flood insurance. So if you want to be covered for flood insurance at all, that's a separate policy. So you can get that through the National Flood Insurance Program. And I mentioned reforms. The reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program were put in place because of the same concept that the National Flood Insurance Program is now in pretty serious debt because of the lack of resources to cover major events. So specifically in regards to the FAIR plan, it's a really great question. A lot of states have FAIR plans, and that is the question for all of them. But the alternative is that the insurance would be extremely prohibitively expensive. So we won't know until it happens whether or not the FAIR plan has the resources to cover the damage, but the alternative is maybe not great either. So
I wanted to ask Steve, where does all your money come from? Is it state or federal or
All
county?
state funding. It began the last year of the development administration. We weren't sure it would continue with the new Baker administration, and really commend that. They've been very supportive, put it in the budget, so we expect the funding to continue.
I have a question for Shannon. I also carry some excess flood beyond the NFIP. If a town like Falmouth does the CRS, would that have any impact on those premiums, or that's totally separate?
it's totally separate. It is only for the National Flood Insurance Program that the discounts apply to. That doesn't mean that insurance company won't recognize that your town is participating in the CRS, so it's possible, but it's absolutely not guaranteed that that would be discounted.
Callie, you talked about transportation assets that are resilient. What are some examples of that, or what makes them resilient exactly? What characteristics?
So being resilient would be knocked out temporarily, but then it could come back online relatively quickly. So it could bounce back. An example of that would be a permeable pavement that I talked about that went down actually all. I don't know if you guys have been to Provincetown, but when you walk around Commercial Street, the pavement is more porous and it's softer and more comfortable to walk on. And so once that gets flooded out, there's the pores are a lot bigger, and so it allows the water to dissipate and perk through a little bit faster. So that would be an example of a resilient infrastructure.
Any other questions? Joe?
Are there any other actions that are happening or about to happen? Or?
Yeah, so I'll give a tiny little bit of history there. So the commission has been working with Federal Highway and Mass DOT. This is now our third year. And it's been mostly planning and vulnerability assessments right now. We, after this sort of round of planning, we're going to kick it into actual adaptation measures, and we'll be looking to CZM and other tools for assistance in figuring out which adaptive strategies would be recommended for going forward. Some of the towns like Provincetown have already used some of the infrastructure like porous pavement or upsizing culverts. That would be another example of an adaptation strategy.
For transportation?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So that will come out soon. We're trying to get these vulnerability assessments finished so we can move on to what are we actually going to actually do. It's a good question.
You spoke about Massachusetts, which is obviously of greatest interest to people here. Are there other coastal parts of our country that are farther along on these issues than
You mean
than Cape Cod?
like some of the planning processes or participation in the CRS or things
Yeah, I
like
mean,
that?
there's a lot of coastal states. Are we ahead of the pack? In the middle, way behind?
I can offer some thoughts, but Shannon, I'll let you go first. 'cause
Okay.
You worked in
I did. So I most recently came from Virginia. Southeast Virginia is at very high risk of flooding. There's a lot of awareness of the issues there. There's a lot of work going on there. I would say they're a little bit further ahead. Florida is a little bit further ahead in some aspects, but Cape Cod is really doing a lot of good work, and I would say is among the forerunners of the states doing forward-thinking adaptation work.
Yes, I could agree with that. We do work with colleagues from other reserves in other parts of the country that work with coastal states, like our partners in New Jersey and New York, after Hurricane Sandy, they were able to kind of see how our community's doing, and we also did some transfer with them, having them talk about their experiences with community officials here, and from that interaction, it seemed like our communities on Cape Cod, at least in terms of the planning processes and stuff, are pretty much further along than those communities were when they were impacted by Sandy. Now, they've obviously galloped ahead with all the funding that comes after a big disaster event, and all the organizations that are there are kind of ready to help. Unfortunately, it's a big disaster, but at least if there is a silver line, if you can find one, is that resources are there to help the communities be a lot more prepared next time around. Communities are in the Gulf of Mexico region are also really trying to use different tools, again, because they've been impacted by a lot more hurricanes than we have been. So some of those patterns change around the country. It definitely shows that where you have more impact, communities tend to be a lot more awake on wanting to do things. But here on Cape Cod, I think we've been trying to be very proactive in terms of putting. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work to be done, but definitely not a sleeper.
Shannon, you mentioned that, well, you had some good slides about what the savings would be region-wide. And you also mentioned that towns have had a hard time getting over the impediment or the intellectual impediment of what the costs were to getting involved with the CRS. And I'm wondering if FEMA runs numbers on what the costs region-wide might look like, so that communities had an idea of how inexpensive it might be to get those initial 5 and 10% savings.
They don't have any actual dollar numbers on costs. They do say that it is pretty easy to get to a class 9 after you meet some prerequisites, as long as you can meet those. Costs are normally in terms of hours. Towns have they can only pay so many people to do so many jobs. So each person has to figure out how many jobs they actually have the time to do. Sure.
So how many other towns managing to do this? The ones that have the green ratings, for example?
Normally, the way CRS participation goes without somebody like me is there's one person in the town that's really motivated to join the program, recognizes the value of the program, and really pushes to make it happen. Most of the towns, actually all 4 now, the person who joined the program for that town is no longer in that town, so they've all moved around. But they've just been really motivated, and they made it a part of their job to make that happen. But the reason that you don't see higher ratings for those towns right now is just the reality of not having time. The other reality is it's a really complicated program, and it takes a lot of time just to understand. Once you're into the program, the annual effort is, I've been told, just a few days if they're at a lower level of the CRS program. Joining can take a few months. The overall application process typically takes 1.5 years. The amount of time per staff person is not necessarily that high. I've heard 10% of somebody's time, I've heard 5%, I've heard 20%. It really depends on the town itself and how much they want to put into it. And maybe how well they know the program as well, and how much research they want to do on each of their activities.
Another, just to add, you can correct me, because I'm more on the hazard planning side, less on the since we work together, but there's an outreach component to getting into the CRS, and you can create an outreach team, and that team of public and stakeholders actively and regularly works with the town. So there's a way for public time to also be used to get the town into the CRS. So that, you know, you were asking about volunteering for the program, that is like an amazing way to get involved, is to be part of that team that the town can continually work with and bounce ideas around with and get activities through. That would be an awesome way for volunteers to get involved.
Yeah, and some towns have committees that, in Virginia, the town I lived in, I was on that committee that helped to decide to join the CRS and figure out how to move forward with it. I want to mention there are a couple other things that are important. There are a lot of activities that towns are already doing that they can get CRS credit for, so it's not necessarily taking on a bunch of new policies or regulations or activities, actions that they have to actually do. It's just taking the time to document them, keep records, and make sure that that information gets passed on to FEMA for CRS credit.
They built over a 2-year project, they built that dune to save the parking lot. I mean, it was extensive with wooden supports and like telephone poles, not just the sand sausages as you referred to them, and there were rocks. And how well is that standing up, and is it being used elsewhere?
There have been projects like that. That was pretty robust with the piles that they used, and there was some look at they were using geosynthetic liners in there, which are not biodegradable. So that was outside of what we would fund and what we could consider a green project. You know, the town was obviously concerned about getting maximum, protection in that area. But yeah, I'm familiar with it. That wasn't one that we funded. There are similar type projects throughout the Cape that
There are.
like that. We're trying to, through this grant program, steer communities. Projects like that can have a lot of impacts to adjacent resource areas. So that's the intent of this program too.